Good afternoon and welcome to Leadership Through the Humanities, Professional Perspectives. My name is Nicoletta Piereddu and I'm the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. Under the auspices of Georgetown College, this initiative promotes interdisciplinary collaborations across departments for research, pedagogy, and public-facing projects that demonstrate the enduring value of the humanities for the understanding of the human condition. The humanities are pivotal to Georgetown's mission as a value-driven institution. They play a crucial pedagogical role in our curriculum, and they are at the center of Georgetown's scholarly and public engagement with the most critical issues of our time. Today's panel not only confirms the impact of the humanities on undergraduate and graduate students, but also highlights the enduring relevance of a humanistic formation well beyond the college experience. We will focus on how humanities education translates into better leadership practices in our professional and personal trajectories. For this initiative, there cannot be a more meaningful partner than Callion, which, as we will hear, promotes the study of the humanities for leadership education and development. I am delighted to introduce the co-executive director of Callion, Dr. Mallory Monaco Caterina. She's a Georgetown alumna in classics, Hoya Saxa, currently a senior professor of practice in classical studies at Tulane University, and the Greenberg Family Professor of Social Entrepreneurship at the Phyllis Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking. She's a cultural historian who specializes in the literature and history of post-classical Greece. Her publications focus on Plutarch's lives of Hellenistic statesmen and the lessons they held for Plutarch's contemporaries in Roman Greece, as well as on the relationship between tyrants and heroines in Plutarch's Virtues of Women. Dr. Monaco Caterini will say a few more words on Callion. She will describe the structure and the goals of our event and will ultimately introduce our panelists. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to give the floor to Dr. Monaco Caterini.
Thank you, Nicoletta, Dr. Piereddu. I'm going to share my screen now and get us started. It is a real delight to be back at a virtual Georgetown. I can't wait to be back at a real Georgetown. And I really want to thank Dr. Piereddu and the Georgetown Humanities Initiative for partnering with Callion on this event, and express gratitude to one of Callion's board members, Philippa Hughes, for making the introduction to Nicoletta in the first place. I also want to thank our panelists, who you'll be hearing more about and more from very soon, for sharing their time and insights and stories with us. And to thank Candace Mosley, who is the wonderful behind the scenes tech support, who's already taught us very much in the past 30 minutes. And all of the students, faculty, staff, and friends of the humanities who are in attendance. In preparing for this event in particular, but more than that, I often reflect on how the education I received at Georgetown in classics and linguistics, and the influence of Jesuit values of academic inquiry, critical self-reflection, and service to others prepared and spurred me to become co-founder and co-executive director of Callion Leadership. So it feels like a very special homecoming to bring a conversation about leadership development and the humanities back to the hilltop, where I learned so much about both. Before we begin the panel in earnest, I would like to take the opportunity to briefly introduce Callion, which you can follow in many different formats and find more information about, but I want to give you a bit of our story so that you have a sense of where this partnership comes from. So Callion is named for the ancient Greek word for nobler or more beautiful, and was founded by a group of humanities professors and researchers who believe that leadership development should be informed by the study of the humanities. Our approach to leadership development was to be distinct from the approaches taken in business schools, military academies, political science departments, or other areas of leadership study. We felt that language, symbols, images, stories, emotions, values, ideas, and ideals should form the foundation of how we think about and practice leadership, and that the study of the humanities is our best resource for that task. The Callion mission has been advanced by a diverse and intergenerational community of staff, board members, and advisors in leadership roles in academia, law, government, politics, education, the military, the arts, the sciences, and the media. Our panelists today are a wonderful representation of that community, whose members, with members whose careers and character are a testament to Callion's vision. Our mission, very grandiosely stated, but meant, is to design and develop communities around the study of the humanities in order to unlock the human talent for creative, benevolent, and lasting improvements to our common condition. For Callion, leadership is the art of meeting the needs of others and empowering them to realize their potential in individual, collective, and institutional settings. We envision a world that is not divided into leaders and followers, but instead consists of empowered agents who respond to common needs according to their particular skills and opportunities. We believe that leadership development in its most effective and efficient form requires at least 4 elements. Humanities artifacts, such as we'll see today, careful, reflective, and informed study of these artifacts, a commitment to lead, to take this study into the real world, and a diverse community to support all of this development to the greatest extent. These 4 elements can be found woven into all of Callion's resources and programming experiences, including our online open access course materials, the Leading Thinkers podcast, which features humanities researchers discussing their work and the relevance it has for current leadership concerns and their own practice of leadership, the International Camp for Democratic Leadership, which, fingers crossed, will be held in person in Rethymno, Crete next summer, so announcement very soon about that, which seeks to promote democratic leadership by bringing together a community of college-age students, educators, and democratically minded professionals into a workshop environment where they can cultivate the behaviors, relationships, and organizational outlook necessary for promoting democratic leadership at all levels of society. And finally, the study to practice faculty development workshops and the new Leading Teachers community of practice, where we support and celebrate humanities educators in their work as leadership trainers. Today's panel is a prelude to a study to practice workshop to be held at Georgetown this spring, where humanities faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates will work together to intentionally design course materials that tap into the potential of the humanities classroom to be a leadership training ground. So today, our goal is not just to wave our hands and assert that the humanities build critical thinking skills, emotional intelligence, cultural competence, the things leaders need today, which is what we all say and is true. But we want to hear from real and inspiring examples of people whose humanities training has shaped their leadership in a wide range of professional contexts, to try to understand how it is that the study of leadership translates into this better practice. So I'm going to introduce our panel. We'll have a discussion where they're each going to be presenting a different humanities artifact that has had an impact on their leadership. Then we'll open it up for a moderated discussion for a period of time. And then there will be time at the end for an open Q&A. That Dr. Piradu will be moderating. So please, as we're discussing, submit questions as you have them through the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar. So that said, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our panel. Andrew Gilmore is a scholar in residence at the Center for the Study of Statesmanship at the Catholic University of America. He previously served as a senior intelligence expert on the Near East, South Asia, and Islam over a 32-year career at the Central Intelligence Agency in a range of managerial and analytic positions. His languages include Persian, French, and Ancient Greek. He holds degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins University. His most recent publication is A Middle East Primed for New Thinking, Insights and Policy Options from the Ancient World. Dr. Nadia Hashimi is a pediatrician, an internationally best-selling author of novels for adults and acclaimed novels for children, and an advocate for women and children. Dr. Hashimi graduated from Brandeis University with degrees in Middle Eastern Studies and biology. She studied medicine in Brooklyn, New York, and then completed her pediatric residency training at NYU and Bellevue hospitals before moving to Maryland with her husband. On days off from a busy emergency room and after years of avid reading, she began crafting stories that drew on her heritage and the complex experiences of Afghans. Her novels include The Pearl That Broke Its Shell, When the Moon is Low, A House Without Windows, and most recently, Sparks Like Stars, which just came out this year. She was also the first Afghan American to run for Congress. She serves on the board of 2 nonprofit organizations dedicated to education in Afghanistan. Dr. Jeffrey Katra received undergraduate degrees in history and government from Georgetown, Wayasaksa, a master's degree in history from the University of Virginia, where he studied the intersection of politics and science in America, and a medical degree from the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. Dr. Katra completed his family medicine training at Lower Bucks Hospital Family Medicine Residency in Bristol, Pennsylvania. He subsequently completed a fellowship in addiction psychiatry at the University of Virginia. He is also a certified hypnotherapist who specializes in chronic pain, phobias, and addictive behaviors. Dr. Katra has certificates in psychopharmacology from the Neuroscience Education Institute, as well as in cannabis medicine from the Lambert Center for the Study of Medicinal Cannabis and Hemp at Thomas Jefferson University. Ashley Robison is a seasoned nonprofit manager with 13 years of experience in programming, project management, communications, and audience engagement. She graduated from Loyola University, New Orleans with a bachelor's in English, writing, and film studies. Ashley earned her master's in arts administration from Indiana University. She currently works at Tulane University as the Associate Director of Global Programs in Alumni Relations. Ashley serves on the board of directors for Daughters Beyond Incarceration and the Young Professionals Ambassadors Circle for the Roots of Music. She previously served on the Young Professionals Committee for the Innocence Project New Orleans for 5 years. Last but not least, Susanna Welford is the founder and president of Running Start, a nonpartisan organization which aims to inspire young women and girls to pursue political leadership. Running Start furthers the work begun by the Women Under 40 PAC, which Susanna co-founded in 1999 and led for 5 years. She's a globally recognized expert on women in politics, and she speaks frequently about the importance of inspiring more young women to enter politics. Susanna received her bachelor's degree in English from Davidson College and her JD from the University of Virginia. Prior to law school, Susanna worked for Hillary Clinton's healthcare task force in the Clinton White House. Before founding WOOFPAC, which I assume is how you say it, and Running Start, Susanna worked as a lobbyist for state and local governments, foreign governments, corporate entities, and trade associations before Congress and the executive branch. So, as I said, each of these wonderful panelists has selected a humanities artifact, a piece of literature, a song, a poem, a film clip, that has inspired or shaped the way they understand and practice leadership in their professional lives. So to begin, I'd like each of you to briefly discuss your artifact and how studying it, thinking about it, reflecting on it has impacted your professional leadership journey or perspective. So we'll start with Andrew.
Thank you, Mallory, and thank you, Nicola. It's a great to see the humanities emphasized like this. I was a comparative religion major at Harvard College. I joined the CIA, and I was of certain a mind that I needed a social science background in order to do my job. So I went to Johns Hopkins and learned all about, international relations theory, international trade, and monetary. I found myself back in Iraq in 2003. Running the CIA's analytic effort inside a war zone. And I realized that I really needed more humanities. Why did I realize this? I was talking to a soldier who was looking at me after a tour, and he said, "Do you have any," looking at me, the supposed geeky guy from Washington, "do you have any ideas about how this could go better in Iraq?" And I realized that the litany of social science explanations, while useful, were not going to be sufficient. And I began to think about Iraq in different terms. And Baghdad does that to one. So that was the beginning of an orientation. But my artifact has to do with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great came to me when I was training in Persian at the CIA. One of my professors looked in shock when I referred to Alexander the Great. He said, "No, he's Alexander the Macedonian." And the reason why he's Alexander the Macedonian is because we don't cherish and honor people that trash our national libraries as Alexander the Great did. So I want to show you this artifact. I'm going to screen share here with you guys. Hold on. So you can see that Alexander the Macedonian, what did I learn by this moment with my Persian instructor? Well, suddenly Iran wasn't just a state that was with modern political borders. It was a state that had an Achaemenid empire that Alexander defeated, that had territorial reach into the Eastern Med. It was the state that had given much of Islam in the Abbasid Caliphate its knowledge and cultural patterns of learning. And it was a state that reached into Central Asia and Afghanistan. Suddenly, by thinking about Alexander the Macedonian, I understood Iranian sensibilities, but also Iranian identity, strategic view, and politics in an important new way. But if you're not working in the Middle East, either in Iraq or in Iran, and you want to know why Alexander the Macedonian matters to you in another field, let me just offer you the next picture. This is a picture by Tom Lovell, and it shows Alexander returning in what would be now modern day Baluchistan between the Pakistan and Iran border. And what he's doing is he's suffering, all his troops are suffering in the desert from thirst. And he's come back from these conquests of the Persian Empire, and he's moving back toward what is now Iraq. And he's caught in this desert. Some soldiers went to look for some water. They found some water. And when they came and they brought it to him, he stood in front of all his troops and he poured it into the ground. What this moment reminds me of is the kind of servant leadership that is really appropriate in difficult, arduous operations and situations. I remember being head of the Arab Springs Task Force at CIA, or the acting director, and the stress of that moment, I recalled this image, and I recalled the need to always be mindful of those around you, and never in leadership roles to be separate from the people you're leading in a fundamental way. And so this artifact for me presents that. So we can talk more about it later, but I'll let the other panelists speak to theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Nadia, would you like to follow up with your artifact?
Yes. Okay, so you know, this was a really interesting exercise, getting us all thinking about how we've had an impact from an actual object or from an actual piece of poetry. And I have to say that, you know, reflecting back on where this caused me to reflect a lot and take a look back at, you know, what I've been doing and why I've been doing it, and kind of, you know, what led me down this path. And to give you just a, you know, quick background, my parents had immigrated from Afghanistan in the early part of the 70s. And so I was born and raised in the United States, New York, New Jersey mostly, and was growing up with two very, very different Afghanistans simultaneously. And so one was the Afghanistan that I inherited from my parents, and this was the Afghanistan that lived in photographs, in stories, in the memories that were passed down from my parents, who had grown up in a rather idyllic and peaceful time in the country's history. And then in sharp contrast, I was watching a very, very different Afghanistan appear in bits and pieces on the nightly news, in the newspapers, and sometimes in movies like Rambo 3, where it was just a country that was war-torn, where women were victims, and then even into, you know, the time period before, when I was going to college, that women were just cloaked in burqas and essentially erased from the public view. And again, the contrast was very, very sharp because I had a mom who had graduated from Kabul University as an engineer. Her sisters had gone to the university. And it really got me thinking about what this means and where were these women getting their energy from when they were pushing to get into education and do all of this, and how could a country lose so much? And you take a look at the stories of women who persisted and survived and ran underground schools, or provided care for their neighbors, or helped their families flee the country during either the conflict or the time that the first Taliban regime ruled. And there's a certain grit and resilience and just sort of remarkable strength that people comment on in Afghan women. And so the artifact that I had pulled out, and I'm going to pull up the poem that goes along with it, but it is something by a woman named Rabia Balkhi. And of course, now I am not able to pull that up. But anyway, so Rabia Balkhi is from the 9th century, and she is a woman who was from a rather elite class. And so she had a mind of her own. She was a thinker. She had a lot of spirit in her by story. And she secretly fell into a love affair with somebody who was part of the military at that time. And unfortunately, her brother learned of her impropriety. And up until that point, she had been writing poems and doing all different kinds of things. But when her brother learned of her impropriety, she actually slit her wrists and wrote her final poem on the walls of her chambers in her own blood. And then, according to the story, and then went into a bath. So she was a figure who was wild, rebellious, committed, and enduring. And this last poem that she wrote on the wall, I'll just read you a translation of a segment of it. Love is an ocean infinite. Only a fool would dare swim in it. But love demands the true lover persist through the end and accept what others would not defend. When you see things hideous, fancy them neat. Eat poison, but taste sugar sweet. And what's been interesting to me has been that she is a woman from the 9th century who fell into a secret love affair, which is taboo today in Afghanistan, and has essentially always been taboo. And yet here she is, this woman who made really big choices that she couldn't carry out completely. She could not actually, see this love affair to fruition. But she was very vocal about it, and she put all of herself into it. And what's been interesting is that she's not seen as a negative figure in Afghan history. And to the contrary, actually, my mother went to Rabia Balkhi High School. There is a maternity hospital in Kabul that's named after her. And so this very rebellious woman, this fiery woman who put love above everything, who put her poetry above everything and refused to submit to others' whims, her name has been on these really important institutions that have endured for decades in Afghanistan. And when people take a look at this poem, they see this not only as the ultimate devotion to love or passion of an individual, but they see it as a complete devotion to any cause, whether that is a political cause or whether that is devotion to the divine, or however that can be interpreted. But it is that kind of commitment on this soul's behalf, and that was seen in this woman who, again, has become quite a figure in the Afghan cultural lexicon. This Rabia Balkhi name. So this is what gets me going when I do anything about Afghan women. I try to write about them from a position of power. I write about them from a position of strength. I talk about them and describe them and show images about them that really try to emphasize this kind of personality, this strength, because I believe that the women who are resistors in today's Afghanistan, the women who are showing up and protesting in the streets just feet away from the Taliban, they're drawing on this ancestral well of resilience. They're drawing on this particular spirit. And it really has been a message to me of how important it is to share stories of strength, and to make sure that we make space for the ancestors, because it really, there is a legacy that passes from one generation to the next. And when we see the sweep, like this really swift recovery that was made in 2002, 2003, coming out of the first Taliban regime, girls and women bounced back so quickly. And I think this is because it is this kind of story that's been imprinted somewhere in our culture, somewhere in our beings and in our souls. And it has a true impact. So again, this is just one of those artifacts, one of those little snippets that I think, I may not recite these lines every day. I may not think about them. I may not have any of these images on my walls, but it's the essence of it that really guides the way I conduct myself in advocacy, and hopefully in my own goals and professional efforts as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. I'm excited to talk more about Rabia. Jeff, Dr. Keitra, will you share what your artifact is?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dr. Jeffrey Keitra, and back when I was at Georgetown, I was a history and government major, and I had desires to be a professor. And I went to the University of Virginia and enrolled in a PhD program in history, and really loved academia. And I think a big part of being an historian is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. That is, for me, was people living in the 18th century. So a lot of my work centered around people like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and their views for the new American Republic. So I ended up reading a lot of their letters and correspondence and treatises that they would write. And it really gave you the opportunity to get into the mind of a lot of people. And like I said, that ability to put yourself in someone's shoes. And later on, when I wanted to go into medicine, what I was really interested in going into was psychiatry, and particularly addiction. And I noticed in medical school, there's a lot of objective things that we learn about medicine. If you want to see if someone has, an infection, you can do a blood test, you can do a swab. If you want to see if they have a certain disease, you can do all kinds of tests for that. But when you talk about things like mental health and addiction, it's not as cut and dry. And in medical school, I would see a bunch of my colleagues, when they were learning, would ask questions like, well, I don't really understand depression. Why don't they just pick themselves up, by the bootstraps and feel better? Or I don't understand addiction. Why can't they just stop? And my artifact is the Pink Floyd song, Comfortably Numb, and I'll explain kind of the background of that in a second. And by the way, Pink Floyd is a great source to mine for not only mental health issues, but also the humanities in general. They have an album called Animals that is about the excesses of capitalism and a lot of things about mental health. One of their band members named Syd Barrett had schizophrenia and slowly deteriorated over the years. And a lot of their songs, including Brain Damage from Dark Side of the Moon, or Shine On You Crazy Diamond from Wish You Were Here, and a good deal of the album The Wall, which has the song Comfortably Numb on it, were about Syd Barrett's descent into madness and kind of deteriorating over time. So to give you some background, Roger Waters, who's the bass player of Pink Floyd, and by the way, before I go any further, I don't think we have time to listen to Comfortably Numb, so I would definitely encourage everyone to YouTube it afterwards, and I'll sort of walk you through it a little bit, so when you listen to it, you can hopefully see it with a slightly new set of eyes, so to speak, or ears. So Roger Waters wrote the album in 1980, and it was pretty much autobiographical about a rock star who becomes very isolated from the audience and becomes almost a fascist in nature, and undergoes problems with sex addiction, depression, and other forms of addiction, including heroin. And the song Comfortably Numb, The Wall is also a movie, so I don't know if anyone has seen the movie, but in the movie, Comfortably Numb is playing while the protagonist of the album is battling heroin addiction. And it really drives home this idea of isolation and otherness that you feel when you become addicted to a substance, or when you have depression, or frankly, other mental illnesses. So interestingly enough, Roger Waters wrote this song while he was in Philadelphia, and he got at a concert in Philadelphia, he got a steroid shot for an injured back, and he felt kind of, as he would describe it, very shaky and woozy. And he was inspired to write this song. And if you listen to the song, it's really divided into two parts. The verses, which are in the lower register, singing wise, sung by Roger Waters, is really a doctor talking to a patient. And this song starts off with the lyrics, "Hello, hello, is there anybody in there? Just not if you can hear me." And there's this idea that the patient is somewhere else. And then in the chorus of the song, we have the kind of ethereal, higher voice of David Gilmour of Pink Floyd sing from the protagonist character's point of view, which is, musically much different, kind of this feeling of being at ease and being isolated from any sort of pain or trouble. And some of the lyrics are, "There is no pain, you are receding, a distant ship smoke on the horizon, you can only come in through in waves, your lips move and I can't hear what you're saying." So I picked Comfortably Numb because I thought it was just a great representation of what it is to be addicted to a substance, or to have things like depression. And many times when talking to a patient about their experiences, the term comfortably numb or the song will actually come up, and they'll be like, "Oh, it's like Comfortably Numb." Or if they're describing things to me, I'll bring up the term comfortably numb and they'll say, "That's it, that's perfect." And I just think that song is just a tremendous way. If you've never been depressed, or you've never been addicted to a substance, as many people have not, it's a good way where you can maybe experience through artistic expression what some of these people feel like or go through. And I think the song does a really remarkable job at that. And I think when you listen to it, you kind of get this isolation, otherworldliness, and disconnection that a lot of people feel. And I would say in total, what I really think, one of the main things I think the humanities can bring to medicine are these artistic expressions that help us understand the human condition much more, particularly when we haven't experienced it ourselves. We all know what a stomach ache feels like. We all know what a headache feels like, but we all don't know what it is to be addicted or to have depression. So that's why I picked that.
Thank you, Dr. Keitra. Ashley, can you share yours?
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to bring a little bit of levity to the room.
I think we need it.
Like Nadia, this was something I was thinking about a lot. And I would often find myself trying to find something that seemed more grown up, more professional, more thoughtful. And I just kept turning back to this one scene in film from a movie I have loved since I was a child, and that would be Jurassic Park. And I think that when you watch the film, there's so many different stories that you can think about, but I think about leadership in the context of this film as there's Dr. Hammond, who is aspirational. What can he do when he has the resources to do anything? And you have Dr. Grant, who's very in the dirt. And then you've got Jeff Goldblum, who has become his own internet sensation the last few years. And this quote about being so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you don't stop to think about whether you should. And I think that, you know, especially in the humanities, thinking about the arts, which is, you know, my background and experience, you know, there is always this line of how far you should go into something in order to make it authentic and true and create this story. But I think that that doesn't always translate into the real world. And so sometimes you get to this point in your life or decisions that you have to actually just stop and think beyond the emotional, beyond the instant, about whether or not you should do this. And I think as a leader, like, you have to stop and be more cognizant of that more and more, because you'll find that, yes, you want to trust your intuition, you want to trust like the deep-seated feelings that you have, but sometimes you need more than that to be the reason you make a decision and choice. Sometimes you need to find a way to quantify it and justify it for others before they'll buy into the decision. And so, you know, it's a film that has lived with me for, you know, 8 years now, as one of my favorites. And I think it's because that when it's one of those films that no matter what I'm thinking about, there's probably a quote or moment that really can speak to like what's going on in real life, even if there aren't dinosaurs roaming the United States currently. You never know when.
Susanna, can you share your artifact with us?
I would love to. You know, it's great being last because I can really just say ditto. Like everything everybody talked about, I absolutely agree. It's all about walking in other people's shoes, learning from other people's stories. So I want to give you a little bit of context for my artifact. So as Mallory said in her introduction, I run a nonprofit organization called Running Start. And what we do is we train young women, high school and college age, to see themselves as leaders, and not just any old leaders, but we want them to run for politics. We want them to run for political leadership positions and, you know, hope to change the numbers. We don't have enough women in politics. We want to get more strong, amazing, diverse women into politics. And so when I loved the prompt too, it was so thoughtful. And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking that to me, my education in the humanities, it both informs me in my leadership and how I do my job, but it also informs the curriculum that we write for the young women to show them this is what you need in order to not just to be a leader, but to be a good leader. And just to tell you a little bit about who comes to our program. So we have young women from every background you can imagine. They come mainly from the United States, but all different corners of the United States and around the world. And they're very, very diverse, meaning some come from really rich families, some come from really underprivileged families. They're every race, every religion. And a really big part of my job is helping to bring them together, helping them to be in a room together and find commonality with people who they've never met anybody who looked like this before or came from this background. So that piece absolutely has been informed by the fact that I've been such an avid reader that when I was probably in middle school, my parents would punish me for reading because I would read novels lying on the bed all afternoon instead of doing chores or doing homework. But the other part, of course, is teaching these young women how, no matter where they come from, no matter what their background is, that there's no barrier to getting as far as you want in life. And there are, as you know, in literature, there are There are a trillion examples of people who come from nothing and go to something great. And so when I was thinking about what my artifact would be, it was kind of a no-brainer because I remember so well in college reading The Color Purple by Alice Walker. And so I grew up, I'm a white woman. I grew up in a relatively privileged background. And this book is about, if you guys have not read it, you should go out and read it right away. But it's about this young woman, Celie, who she's a woman of color. You find out later that she's gay. She's been terribly abused by everybody in her life. She grows up poor. And it's the story of her awakening. So she is the type of person who nobody expects anything from her in life. I mean, she's almost like a piece of property. Her father gives her away. Her husband does whatever he wants with her. Nobody believes in her. There are no expectations around her. And, coming from my perspective, watching this woman who was so different from my life experience, figure out a way to come out of that life where there are no expectations, and then to find herself and to be able to create a life for herself where she felt powerful and that she felt like she had agency. I mean, it still gives me chills today, because I think, at Running Start, we've so frequently had people come in who say, I could never, I'm here because I'm interested in politics, but I could never be a leader because XYZ, because I'm Muslim and there are not very many Muslims in politics, or, I'm undocumented and I couldn't do it. And everybody has excuses about why they can't be a leader. And so I think it's helped me so much to have all of these stories in my head of people who were able to prevail despite everything. So that's my artifact.
Thank you. This has been such a rich buffet, I think, of different things that we can all be taking from approaching the humanities, whether it's stories or metaphors or ways to find common ground. I think you've all really touched on how the humanities helps us to tap into what it is to be human, and what it is to be a human other than the one human we each get to be, and how powerful that can be in so many different avenues. So something that we think about here with Callion and with the Georgetown Humanities Initiative as we're preparing for a spring faculty pedagogy workshop is, how do we draw this out more in the classroom? So you can think about this in a couple of different ways. One is there a particular humanities course that sticks out in your mind, or an assignment that you did that sort of changed the way you view everything? Or you can think about it, if you want to, from more of a deficiency standpoint. Now that you're in the world, what do you feel like has been the biggest gaps that you've had to overcome or piece together between the classroom and where you are? And I'll just open that up. So this part will open it up to anyone.
Well, I was just speaking, so I feel like, why not just keep on? It's interesting. I think to me, I was undergrad, I was an English major, and then I went to law school a few years later, and then have done political jobs. And I always felt that when I told people I was an English major, they're like, oh, you can't get a job doing that, or that doesn't prepare you for anything. And that's so frustrating to me, because I think what I learned in undergrad as an English major in some ways is much more applicable to my life right now than my law degree. It was so fundamental to how I think and how I interact with the world. And it very, very much has always bothered me that if I had said, I was an economics major and a poli-sci minor, that people would have reacted differently. And I wish we could change that perception.
I think for me, going back to what I was talking about, in medical school, you learn a lot of objective things. You learn where all the muscles are, you learn where, what certain medications do and their side effects and everything. But I think to be a very effective physician, you have to understand people. And I think you can do that, as previously discussed, by, learning other people's stories, or appreciating other people's stories, but also just experiencing life. I really think it would behoove a lot of students to maybe take time after they graduate from undergrad and experience a lot of what's in life, to travel and see different ways that people live, and can live their lives, and how a society functions, and how it sets itself up. So I'm actually an advocate of telling people, before you go to medical school, live your life, do other things, get other experiences that you can bring to the table. Another thing is, at least for medical school, one of the things to get, the requirements to get in, the only humanities requirement that I know of, unless it's changed in the last couple of years, is like a writing class or an English class. And of course, a writing or English class is very important. You have to know how to write. Every day when you see a patient, you have to write a note, and you're essentially telling the story of that patient, not only that day, but overall. So writing skills are very important. I still think that is, but to even go beyond that, to really maybe require classes that are, that deal with film and literature, or the classics. So you're learning more perspectives and more stories, as it were. And perhaps those are the experiences that medical schools should be really requiring from students, rather than just getting a certain score in the MCAT, which doesn't really show anything except how you perform in tests. It's not going to show what kind of doctor you're going to be. So, for me, requiring a strong humanities background, maybe even a co-major with a pre-med requirement in a humanities would be, a great way to go.
Andrew, would you like to jump in?
Yes, I just would like to recall when I was an undergrad, learning about how to do comparative religion with a sort of anthropological and University of Chicago style vocabulary. And I remember my parents being kind of horrified that this was the stuff that their tuition money was being spent on. And yet I found myself several years later at the CIA, and being tapped to run our analysis or analytic effort on Islam, not a religion per se, but in its political expression. And if I hadn't learned the vocabulary of how to speak about religion that I learned in those early years, I think I would have been much less effective in dealing with largely secular policy elites on topics of religion and topics of how religious identity is incorporated into society and into social compacts and into personal being. And all of those things, to speak in the right vocabulary, was really important. So I look back on that as absolutely essential. And more broadly, I think the challenge for the humanities is to really be as human as possible, and to remember that the locus of political life and social life ultimately is human, and that we have to have a vocabulary and a discourse that is not too technical and not too overly scientific, but actually remembers the locus of humanity, and that it can come at in many different ways. So I am a real grateful student of the humanities after seeing it so relevant in my career.
Andrew, I think that you kind of touch on something that crosses my mind a lot, which is that I think in the humanities, leadership's not a word you hear a lot. Maybe if you're in history, it is. Maybe in the classics you do. Thinking myself from, a fiction background, English fiction background, a theater background, a film background. You hear words like pioneers, you hear auteurs. This is my new cat. And so you hear these words, but leadership isn't talked about. When you're doing theater, there are roles and positions of leadership. I think about a stage manager, I think about a production manager. And so often the training of those becomes reliant on the technical. How organized are you? Can you keep the director on track? Can you keep your crew building a set on time? But you're not being trained for the volatility that you're going to experience as a leader, particularly when you're working with an artistic temperament. Working with artists, has been probably the greatest leadership lesson of my life, because you're working with this, broad range of personalities. And I think that everyone finds that when they get to the real world. But sometimes, like, having these thoughtful, cognizant discussions about it don't happen in that classroom, and thinking about this real world gap, there's the gap between having the conversations. My role prior to returning to Tulane was at an organization called the Young Leadership Council, where we worked with early to mid-career adults on developing professional leadership skills. And I just kind of went into the role going, what is leadership? I don't consider myself a leader. I'm a big imposter in this organization. But particularly when we had a new executive director come on who had done a lot of research on leadership, and the way she defined leadership kind of was this like light bulb moment of, oh, like these are things that, because of my humanities background, I do intuitively, and nobody has given me the framework to talk about them. And I think that one more gap in the real world I find is that if you're not working within the humanities, it can really be hard to like schedule the time to bring them back into your life. And, for somebody like myself, it can feel very soul sucking to not have the time and capacity to invest myself in like film theory or literary theory. And I'm thankful the one good habit I have is reading every night, because that at least like kind of ties back to this period that was very nurturing and creative and fulfilling for myself.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I'm loving everything that I'm hearing, especially as someone who was both pre-med and a biology major and a Middle Eastern Studies major at the same time, because I wanted to dive into subjects that I figured I won't actually have time later in my life to get into. And yet what's happened is that I have had time to get back into things that were not really related to the pre-med track, that were not strictly science, and yet are very integrated into, the way that I have brought different interests together. And I think that's one thing, is for younger people to take a look and realize that you don't have to pick a single career track and decide that that's what you're going to be and that's what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And so the more well-rounded our students are, the better. Obviously, the humanities and literature and all of that is exactly what enriches people and makes them more well-rounded. The one element that I would add, and the one thing that I didn't really get to study that I kind of wish I could, especially because of some of the stuff that I'm doing now, is psychology. And I think we see that as an element in literature, right? Because all of the characters, when we talk about them, we're talking essentially about the psychology, the flaws, the strengths of these individuals, how it plays out. But psychology as a subject has become so relevant in the business world, where we talk about organizational psychology. And I think the same thing would play out in the diplomatic world, in politics as well. We think about, what is the psychology of this particular entity, this political entity, and how can we kind of negotiate with them, right? Because that's what has to happen at the end of the day. To avoid conflict, we've got to have conversations, we've got to have negotiations and engagements. And the more we can understand the psychology of individuals and of group entities as well, the more fruitful we can be in peaceful engagements, rather than seeing more conflict happen across the world. And then, of course, when it comes to leaders, I think it's really important to start to recognize those elements of psychology that would clue us in that this is a good leader. And then other elements that would clue us in that, hey, this is probably not a good person for a leadership role. And we talked about that, I think, in the previous administration, because there were some obvious signs of pathology, right? But in general, I think it's time to take a stronger look what makes up a person's character and what's leading into their decision making, because sometimes the decisions that people are making are actually reactions that come from somewhere else, as opposed to, what do I need to do for the people that I'm supposed to represent right now? And that's where I think that, we can just have a little bit more judicious selection if we understand people's psychologies better.
One thing that I can speak on as well as I'm hearing other people talking is I feel one thing that the humanities really helps students with is to be open-minded. And I think that's very important in science. And I think it was mentioned about me that one of the things that I do in addiction and psychiatry is I do cannabis medicine, and I'm also spearheading a movement to use psychedelics in things like addiction and depression and other mental illnesses. And there are a fair amount of doctors, in my world that are very open to the idea, but there are some that are not, who are not. And I think it's difficult for a lot of people when, because they pigeonhole certain things. I teach classes on cannabis medicine, and one of the things that I do is I give a pretty detailed history of cannabis in America. And cannabis went through 100 years or so of a lot of politicking. In the 1930s, it was, part of the prohibition movement, and it was also part of a movement against Mexican immigration. In the 1970s, it was made a Schedule I drug as a reaction to the 1960s counterculture, as were psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin. And you can see that these things that suffered from politics back then, being pigeonholed as one way, are now returning in society with a totally different perspective. That cannabis, when used correctly, can help with chronic pain and PTSD and anxiety and a bunch of other things. And perhaps that psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin mushrooms can be used to help rewire the brain away from what we'll call the addicted mind or the depressed mind, or even, to help people, let's say, with autism spectrum disorder to closely feel empathy or societal cues. So I think the one thing I've noticed about people who have a lot of background in the humanities is that they don't tend to pigeonhole things, and they can create new perspectives for things. So I don't know, perhaps maybe some psilocybin for Trump. I don't know. But yeah, that open-mindedness, I think, is very important in science, to discover new modalities of treatment and not to get weighed down by past beliefs.
Could I add just a quick thought there, Mallory? Yeah, just the on open-mindedness. One of the things that humanities has helped me understand about the Middle East, and I'm welcome Nadia's thoughts on this as well, is that you have a lot of parties in the region who will do competing narratives and for political and strategic reasons, be very confrontational with each other. But if you have a humanities background and some control of the languages, you can look at the amount of cultural cross-fertilization and knowledge exchange and parallel collaboration that goes across otherwise strategically competitive peoples. You can see and locate a much more collaborative spirit in pursuit of knowledge and exchange of knowledge, including medical knowledge, including scientific knowledge, and literature. And I think that's one of the great things about humanities is that you're able to probe more deeply into the relationships that are so politically difficult, and it sometimes offers diplomatic opportunity and an ability to see new policy options.
So I think, oh, Nadia, I'll let you go. Sorry.
No, I appreciate that perspective, and I just, I obviously agree with it. It's interesting because I think that if we understood the people we were engaging with who were a bit unlike us, so if for countries in the West dealing with countries in the East, I mean, there's just got to be a more a richer understanding. And I hear so often people saying, well, we just made so many mistakes in Afghanistan because we didn't know the people. We didn't know what the culture was. We didn't know the lay of the land. And what is that? We knew the geography, like we knew the hard pieces of it, right? But we just didn't know. I think what we didn't know was the humanities aspect. And so just like you're saying, I mean, would things have turned out differently if we had taken a more thoughtful approach and taken the time to do that homework? We might have a very different outcome, or at least a somewhat different outcome.
So I think that you all are actually getting me to my next question, and you've brought up a couple of things already. So in Callion, we spend a lot of effort not saying the word leader. We talk a lot about leadership, but not actually about leaders, because we find, and some of you, for example, Ashley kind of mentioned this, you don't see yourself, some people see that word as exclusionary. I don't fit into that identity, right? But if you start talking about leadership and breaking it down into different components or aspects or behaviors or skills that you work on, people can start seeing a list of things and say, oh, I do that. I'm that way. And then it starts to spark this moment of realization that maybe this is an identity that I can inhabit. So instead of talking about leaders, sometimes we'll use the phrase agents of leadership, which I think has a nice comic book superhero ring to it. So with that in mind, and I think we've talked about some of these, what superpower would you say that the study of the humanities has given you as an agent of leadership? So what distinguishes you from the mere mortals who haven't spent their time reflecting as we all have on this? Susanna, I'll put you on the spot first to think about it.
It's funny, I have a feeling, but I'm just trying to think of what the word is. It's so, all right, I'll try to call on my English major skills and articulate. So I really think, because I have read so many stories of so many people in so many different situations, that I mean, it's not empathy, but it's like I look at other people and I feel the worlds behind what I can see. So, you know, we encounter people and their actions can be so bewildering sometimes. And I think that that's, you know, that ability to think, what's actually going on? What are the different paths that brought this person to where they are right now? I think that that is probably all of our superpower, because you don't take things on face value maybe as much as other people would do. And I, you know, just going back to what everybody has said so far, but we all have our own identities and we know what we know. And just this idea of being able to see beyond that, to understand, as Jeffrey said, to understand what it's like to stand in somebody else's shoes. You just think, why are there not more people who, you know, share this study? Because it's obviously what the world needs, right? We need more empathy. We need to have, you know, to give other people a little bit of grace and think, you know, maybe I need to consider where they've come from and what's really going on.
Grace is a great word, and I feel like it's the word of the last year and a half. It's certainly the word that I've been hearing out of the people who I would consider the best leaders during the pandemic, in the sense that I think that it has really humanized a lot of us to see each other working from home, to see our cats or our children interrupting a Zoom. And I think that I'm hopeful that like this shared experience will make people more graceful towards themselves and to others.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I would say for me, the leadership in my field really comes in the form of teaching and advocacy. I really love to teach. I mean, part of my job is going through University of Virginia and you know, teaching skills to you know, other family doctors. It's just funny, like at at the university, anytime someone has to give a lecture, they're always like, get Jeff, find Jeff, he'll do it. And because I love to do it. I think the humanities has given me the education about how to teach myself and how to teach others, how to be persuasive, how to be open-minded, how to, you know, follow the science, but change, you know, the way people think about certain things. And I think it's been invaluable to me. It's given me, you know, communication skills and the ability to write well. And I think that's crucial to how I'm providing, or at least trying to provide leadership in my field. And it's stuff that comes directly from the humanities, those teaching and communication and persuasive, you know, skills where you can actually advocate for a treatment or for your patient or for anything that you think is right.
Jump in, Andrew.
Yes, I just add that I think that I don't claim to have any superhuman powers. That would be hubris, and the Greeks tell us that hubris is a bad thing, so we won't do that. But I will say that by focusing, as I'm doing in my post-CIA life, I'm writing all about ways to think about the world and the Middle East in particular, less through the prism of modernity, American primacy, and technology and modernization, the things that have been very much part of the cultural meme of American foreign policy, but to also think about this region and its neighbors with ancient patterns and ancient precedents that echo into the modern world, and to understand meaning and identity as something that is constructed by history and the past, and not just the moment. So we need to look deeper than just the American lens that we wear, and I think that's where humanities has been absolutely essential. And I'll just say that if you want to understand Iran, you can certainly do a lot of political science, but it's really helpful to learn Persian, because if you begin to read the Persian language, you begin to understand what's called غير مستقيم, the indirect nature of communication, and it's in the very writing itself. And the writing itself is communicative of a way that folks in Iran will think at a high level, popular level, and in between. So.
Nadia, what do you think is your superpower?
I don't know if it's a superpower, but I think it's super important to have empathy, because I think that if your actions are guided by empathy, you really can't go wrong. You know, if you're in a position where you're making decisions about people, if you're in a position where you're teaching about people, if you are, you know, just making choices that have any kind of impact on others, and if you're making those with empathy at the forefront, then you're probably going in the right direction. And I think that's what's been really important for me when I write stories. I write stories that I hopefully will are crafted out of empathy and will lead the reader down a path of empathy as well. And, you know, I think we all have empathy. We have empathy for the people who are in our families, for the people around us. But what's really interesting and what's really, I think, remarkable is when we can start to build paths of empathy towards people, populations, or groups that might surprise us, that we wouldn't otherwise necessarily kind of come to understand, because we have maybe some misconceptions about them, or just poor understanding. Or I mean, I'm thinking of a group of, you know, like we're talking about addiction here. Sometimes it's hard for folks who have no contact with the world of addiction to understand and empathize what it might be like, what might lead a family to make certain choices, what might lead someone with an addiction issue to make their choices as well. But if we can come at everything with a perspective of empathy, then I think we just have more productive conversations, engagements, and decisions.
Thank you all. Yeah, they're all superpowers. You're all superheroes as far as I can tell. So at this point, I want to pass it over to Dr. Piradou for the open Q&A, and I do invite everyone who's attending to submit questions for the group. I know I have more, but I want to be someone who is generous and shares this wonderful resource we have here. So Nicoletta, please take it away.
Thank you, everybody. It has been extremely inspiring, and I hope that the audience will feel free to use the chat, not the chat, sorry, we are contradicting ourselves, the Q&A function, please, to submit questions. I am trying to open it, and I hope, well, for the moment, we don't see, I don't see any particular.
I see one here.
I see one, yes, absolutely. So in addition to praising what appeared on screen, including the cat, the question I see is, can you share a time a colleague's lack of humanities thinking jeopardized the team effort? How did you intervene to right the ship? So any experience that you can share?
You're on mute, Jeff.
Oh, okay. Now I can be heard. Yeah, working in medicine, I mean, you're working on a team, and there needs to be a lot of collaboration. And sometimes you're going to disagree about a patient's treatment, or, what's to be done for them, to help improve their lives. And in order to get through conflict, I think it's important that you understand the human condition, you understand people, and how to get through to them, how to be persuasive. So I think, in a lot of ways, those communication skills are so necessary to understand how people can be sensitive, and your wording and the way you put things, and how that's going to affect how your message is going to get through to someone else. And I think those communication skills have helped me work in a collaborative environment with other people, because you learn how to sort of get your point across without, in the most positive way possible.
I'm thinking about the word soft power, because it seems to me that soft power aligns with what we're talking about. I mean, it's looking at EQ, emotional intelligence. It's not just trying to ramrod something through. It's a much more nuanced approach to power. And there have been so many times in my career where most people wanted to go the hard power approach. And frankly, I've been called, too soft, sometimes with my approach. But I have seen time and time again that the people who use soft power, which is, you could call it diplomacy, that they're the ones who get things done that stay done, that are able to, accomplish something. And then sometimes with hard power, you might win, but then immediately things change because you don't have happy parties on all sides. And to me, having this humanities background encourages you to use soft power because it is a more nuanced approach to dealing with other people.
Other feedback on this crucial issue on how to practice the art of compromise. Essentially, how can we use our humanities skills to overcome polarization? I mean, I think in all domains we encounter situations where probably our background in literature and the arts, as many of you have pointed out, can provide alternative models, a sort of narrative imagination that can help us materialize different scenarios beyond the obvious. It's incredible to see how much what we absorb in alternative worlds, the worlds of, again, the arts, of imagination, can have a connection with what we undergo on a daily basis, and suggest us how to make choices. I think we were facing the issue of what does it mean to be a leader in the humanities. Is leadership the right term to define what a humanist does, or what this component does in our life and profession? But to make choices, we need courage, right? And be ready to make mistakes and learn from them, and accept that also in terms of truth, nothing is univocal. Truth cannot be monolithic. And so we are exposed to a plurality of visions and approaches that are one of the foundations of our humanistic education. So perhaps we can elaborate on that while we wait for other possible questions from the audience.
One thing I think is very important. I mean, talk about an important time to understand the intersection between medicine and politics. There are people in this country who refuse to wear masks, who refuse to get vaccinated, primarily because of a political ideology. And understanding that, not only, well, let me put it this way. The one thing that the humanities can do for everybody is teach them how to evaluate information.
Yes.
We live in this world of infinite information that you can get from the internet. You can watch whatever cable news show fits what you want to hear. And this has led to not only polarization in our society, but a dangerous amount, in fact, of misinformation. And I find myself talking to a lot of patients who will say, I'm not getting vaccinated, or I refuse to wear a mask in your office because it's tyrannical government control, or because they're going to put a microchip, in the vaccine that's going to track everywhere I go, while they're holding their phone, which of course doesn't track them anywhere. But I have really had to sit down and think, how do I get through to a patient who is so emotional and is so steadfast in their beliefs about vaccination, about COVID, about wearing masks and everything? And if you just simply tell that person, well, I'm a doctor and you're wrong and you don't know what you're talking about, that is not going to get through to them. You have to be able to understand where they're coming from, and to understand what their fears are, why they are susceptible to certain types of misinformation, and how you can help them see a new perspective without being threatening to them. Because I think a lot of people will instantly shut down if you say, no, you're wrong, that's just not right. There has to be some, as other people have mentioned, diplomacy in there in order to get through to people, to help change their perspective on things. And very literally, in the case of medicine, it's about life or death. There are people that die because they haven't been vaccinated, and they, on their deathbed, literally will say things like, don't give me the vaccine, or that type of thing. So the humanities have helped me to understand where people are coming from, so I can best communicate to them the medical knowledge that they need to know.
Thank you. That's definitely very powerful and timely. I don't know whether anybody has.
If I could just add that in the world of international affairs, I think that the humanities has a great deal to bring by focusing a vocabulary of human dignity, myth, even national myth and past, and as an ability to deal with the non-material and non-scientific aspects of the human experience, which find their way into political activity, and which find their way into all sorts of things, critically and thoughtfully and respectfully the non-material and the what I would call the poetic imaginations and mythic identities of other peoples, and do so respectfully. We will inevitably fail in political discourse and in And it's just a basic thing that humanities helps us get at. So human dignity and non-material aspects of our political life, I think, are within the scope of humanities and are empowering in our current political moment.
Certainly. I see two more questions coming up. So one starts by referring to the beginning of the movie 500 Days of Summer, where we are told that Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character has developed unrealistic and naive notions of romance based on a gross misunderstanding of the ending of The Graduate. So the question is, should we be concerned about misreading a humanities artifact because of how that might hinder leadership? Are there some humanities artifacts that are actually harmfully empowering?
One thing that comes to my mind, at least, and I don't know if anyone else can speak like this, I mean, another problem in our society right now that we're dealing with besides polarization is kind of this increasing disrespect for expertise, that no one wants to listen to the expert who are part of, quote, the elite. And there's maybe an idea in the humanities that everyone's opinion is equal. And in some ways, opinions can be. They can be equal. But when we're talking about things, going back to what I said before, like vaccinations and mask wearing and everything, there has to be some trust in expertise. You know, a PhD, an MD, a DO, a master's degree, these have to mean something. And I think to the general public right now, there is a crisis of expertise. So one thing in the humanities is, you know, propagates that I think is important, that yeah, everyone's opinion matters, but that also has to be in the context of, you know, we also need to have, you know, meaningful expertise. So to me, that is something that maybe is an unrealistic expectation that's offered maybe by some of the humanities, that, you know, my view of a certain novel or my view of a film or whatever is just as equal to everyone else's. Okay, yeah, but when we're talking about art, but, you know, when we're talking about something that's factually based, you know, you have the right to your own opinion, but not your own facts. So that's that. But that also goes back to the idea of evaluating information, that the humanities should teach. Yeah, you should form your own opinion, but there should be kind of this respect for expertise and knowledge. You know, of someone who has a PhD or you know, someone who was trained in that and have given their lives for many years to become educated in that.
But, you know, I'm also just thinking that if you read just a narrow segment of literature, you know, you might walk away with a certain opinion. But one of the great things to me about studying the humanities is seeing that, you know, over millennia, people have been writing the same stories, that we tend to have the same themes represented again and again and again, and that, you know, you might read one book and come away with the wrong lesson, as the questioner was just saying. But I think if you read 1,000 books, which probably all of us have, or see 1,000 movies, you see the human condition represented in such a similar way again and again and again. And I think that's what we're bringing with us. It's that amalgam of all of these different experiences that all have commonalities that makes it hard to get it wrong, in my opinion.
If there are no other remarks on this powerful question, which really raises the issue of where to draw boundaries, right? I mean, Umberto Eco would answer by saying, okay, limits of interpretation, the limits of interpretation, not that everything is possible, right? So that's definitely important to see that it's not licensed to say anything. There are norms there are methodologies, and also the critical mass of our humanities experience experience, as also Susanna was saying, can somehow point at more reliable options over other ones. But certainly it is an ethical issue there. And I don't know, Nadia, were you trying to say something? Otherwise, I was shifting to the following question. Please feel free to intervene.
No, I just, Norman's question really was an interesting one. I think two things. One is it would be really dangerous to have people watching The Graduate maybe alone. And so we talk about not watching, one piece of a story, but also just not watching it alone, because somebody in the room with you could say, no, don't take it that way. There's another way to look at this story. And so I think our collective knowledge, our collective understanding is important. And then also thinking about artifacts that might hinder leadership just immediately made me think of the Confederate flag and these artifacts of the Confederacy, that we think about what the impact of that is on our society and on other types of leadership or of groups that are looking to vie for some control as well. And I think there's definitely a way to have some toxicity there through those.
Certainly, thank you for your remarks, which are a very good way of connecting to another question from the audience. How can we use leadership training of people already at the undergraduate level or higher to combat the lack of support, critical thinking education before college education? So again, is there a way in which we can provide that background, more education, so as to create more sophisticated readers and humanists? Is there something we can do in terms of leadership training?
Well, I like Jeffrey's idea that no matter what discipline you are going into, that you have a piece of the humanities as part of your education. Because I think that there are plenty of people who graduate from college these days who don't really get any of it. So if you're going to be an engineer, if you're going to be a doctor, whatever it is, that you should know how to write, and you should, be able to read not just nonfiction, but fiction too, and understand the importance of it.
You're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry, I really like this mute button. I was going to say, certainly we live in a society now of competing narratives, and this leads to a lot of conspiratorial thinking and everything. So maybe a certain education at an earlier stage to really, realize that things in culture are a conversation, and there are narratives that, have a purpose behind them, or that have a context, or that are trying to fulfill some purpose. Maybe even looking at, educating people in the nature of propaganda, which I think is becoming more and more of a problem. But other than that, the thing that I see a lot is that perhaps we can use leadership, or that real leadership in America is not only thinking of your own interests, but thinking of your own interests and those of other people. And this used to be kind of a thought of, let's say, capitalism, taught by Adam Smith, that everyone's, personal desires and personal interest, if everyone just, votes for their personal interests, then, it will all kind of work out in the end. And then that's the greatness of capitalism. But what Adam Smith, said in The Wealth of Nations is that we can't just think of ourselves. We have to think of ourselves and others. And perhaps when people are making decisions, whether they be political or scientific, that would change things. When going to the voting booth, thinking of what's my financial interest, but also what is the financial interest of society as a whole. Or another great example would be vaccinations, that I'm getting vaccinated not only to protect myself from the virus, but also to impede the spread of the virus so it doesn't mutate and become something worse. I think there's a crisis in American culture right now of kind of this self-centered view of everything, that I only do what's good for me. And it's ironic that there's so much talk of patriotism in our current political dialogue, but that patriotism doesn't somehow connect to, I'm going to do not only what's right for me, but what's right for my country and my fellow citizen. So bringing other people into that perspective, I think, was really important.
Certainly, the social contract. We have forgotten what it means, unfortunately, certainly. So also in that respect, a lot of people in literature can teach us something, right? Starting from Rousseau. There is another question which can allow us to continue this issue of how the humanities can solve that crisis. Also the polarization in terms of STEM versus humanities. And the question is, as a recent graduate of a tier 1 research institution, I have heard many STEM students complain about having to take general humanities courses, such as race and inclusion or English classes. They feel this is unnecessary and a waste of time, between inverted commas, when they could be studying the hard sciences. And so how can understanding the humanities as leadership training help us close this gap?
I'd like to jump in because I spent several years working in graduate and postdoctoral studies. I have found that as more and more students have to look at alt-act careers, that a lot of times those who are in the STEM disciplines lose sight of how to talk about the work they do outside of the context of what they're doing. They have lost sight about the transferability of the skills that they're learning in a lab. And I think that being in the humanities classes gives you that framework to talk to different people about what it is you're doing. And so, when I think about leadership, I think that those who are in that, I've worked under many provosts who were all STEM oriented, but I think that they always had a good basis in humanities, and that's what made them compelling leaders and able to get that far in the institution, because you need to be able to communicate and exist outside of the narrow framework that you're probably like studying into. I was probably terrible at my job because a lot of times I would tell people, it doesn't matter what you're getting your degree in, finish and go, because if you're a student, you're going to learn for life. Whether it's theoretical physics or astrophysics, once you got a career, you can kind of keep learning and growing and doing new research. And education can be such a gift that you really need to take it for all that it can be and realize that, trust the system. Mallory talked about coming from a Jesuit institution, and I went to one as well. And, I am thankful that my Jesuit institution let me take classes on Hinduism and Buddhism, that I read medieval philosophy, that I was forced to take string theory physics and completely feel humiliated about my inability to understand it, because it just let me come out into the world more able to bridge that gap between the classroom and real life.
Thank you. I mean, excellent way of, unfortunately, closing this very exciting conversation. We're already over time, and I'm sure there are so many other remarks that we could provide to enrich what has already been said. But it has been a fantastic experience, precisely for many reasons, but also precisely because experiences from different domains have reinforced a series of basic ideas about the crucial role of the humanities. And I really hope that our audience, be they students, faculty members, or from the general public, have appreciated how important this component of our educational life is. So I really want to thank all of you for enriching us with your remarks, excellent organization, and I really hope the workshops in the spring will allow us to zoom in on projects that can be accomplished for the classroom and other areas of our life and profession. So thank you very much again. The Georgetown Humanities Initiative will continue the discussion on the significance of a humanistic formation beyond the hilltop next week on the 28th at 4 p.m. with From Poetry to the Private Sector, Georgetown Alumni in Big Data. And so please check our website and calendar of events at humanities.georgetown.edu, or follow us on Twitter, drop us a message if you wish to join our mailing list or give suggestions for events or other or anything else, any other remarks. We have a suggestion box on the website. Thank you so much to all of you, and I look forward to the next steps. Bye-bye. Thanks.